The soft hum of the engines echoed through the first-class cabin as passengers trickled in, greeted by polished smiles and practiced gestures. Outside the window, the fading sunlight painted the tarmac in shades of gold and tangerine, casting long silhouettes across the wing of Flight 497. The jet stood poised for departure on a quiet evening out of JFK International bound for Geneva. Seated in 1A, Jasmine. Reed leaned back slightly, exhaling a slow breath she didn't even realize she'd been holding. She had made this trip dozens of times before, but tonight felt different. Not because of the flight itself, but because of what it represented. A new chapter, a new ceiling to break. Her fingers rested on a worn leather notebook she always carried, part planner, part journal, part blueprint for a future she had built from scratch. She flipped it open with care, the pages already filled with tightly penned notes, strategy frameworks, investor profiles, foreign regulatory hurdles. Everything was in place for the final meeting that awaited her across the Atlantic. One signature and the biodata platform she founded could secure the largest international partnership in its history. She wore success gracefully, the tailored navy pantsuit and understated jewelry accenting the quiet confidence she carried everywhere. Her heels didn't announce her presence, but her poise did. Jasmine Reed wasn't born into wealth or privilege. Raised in a one-bedroom apartment on Chicago's South Side, she had grown up learning how to navigate silence that spoke louder than words, stares that questioned her place systems built to exclude. Her mother's hands, calloused from double shifts at the hospital, had passed down a simple truth. Nothing given was ever free, and everything earned came with weight. Today, she was CEO of one of the fastest-growing biotech analytics firms in the country. She sat where few like her had ever been allowed to sit. And 1A wasn't just a seat, it was a symbol of how far she'd come, and how firmly she intended to stay. As the last beams of sunlight filtered through the oval window beside her, Jasmine adjusted her blazer and reached for the sparkling water left on her tray. The quiet clink of glass against metal tray table echoed faintly as she took a measured sip. Around her, flight attendants offered pillows and drinks to the other elite travelers, many of whom hadn't even glanced her way. That suited her fine. She didn't come here to be seen. She came here to lead. The overhead compartments clicked shut. The safety lights blinked to life. The intercom buzzed softly with boarding confirmations. But Jasmine felt something shift, not in the cabin, not on the plane, but in the air itself. Something unseen, subtle but certain. She didn't know it yet, but this flight, this ordinary departure from New York, was about to become anything but routine. And she would be ready. The final boarding call echoed faintly down the jet bridge as the last few passengers trickled into the first-class cabin. Jasmine kept her attention on her notebook, but the energy in the air shifted the moment a new presence entered. It wasn't loud or chaotic, just sharply distinct, like a change in barometric pressure before a storm. A woman swept in wearing a tailored cream blazer, the kind that signaled curated wealth rather than fashion. Her platinum blonde hair was sculpted in deliberate waves, her heels clicking with crisp finality on the aircraft floor. She didn't just walk down the aisle, she claimed it. Close behind her came another woman, quieter in both posture and presence, trailing a designer tote nearly the size of a carry-on. Jasmine didn't look up immediately, but she could sense the subtle narrowing of eyes, the mental calculation, the scan of rows, then the pause. The kind of pause that always carried an unspoken question. "What are you doing here?" The woman stood motionless in the aisle for a moment, her gaze fixed on Jasmine's seat. Her expression remained unreadable, but her body language betrayed more than words ever could. There was no smile of acknowledgement, no glance to confirm a misunderstanding, only expectation and entitlement. Flight attendants continued their work without interruption, offering beverages and assisting other passengers with minor requests. The woman remained planted just beside Jasmine's row, her manicured nails tapping a slow rhythm on the leather strap of her handbag. Her companion whispered something with a hesitant smile, but it was met with a flick of the wrist and a narrowed glare that dismissed further discussion. Jasmine, still composed, turned a page in her notebook. She had lived this moment before, not on airplanes necessarily, but in boardrooms and conferences and hotel lobbies. The expressions changed. The setting shifted, but the undertone remained the same. Her presence had somehow disrupted an unspoken order. Moments later, a flight attendant paused by their row. His clipboard angled politely. His eyes moved from Jasmine to the standing woman, then back again. There was tension in his stance, a flicker of discomfort he tried to mask with professionalism. He wasn't sure how to proceed, but the unspoken weight of loyalty to premium status and perceived hierarchy hovered behind his eyes. The blonde woman gestured with quiet insistence, then pointed toward Jasmine's seat. She didn't raise her voice, but her entire posture demanded a rearrangement of the situation in front of her. It was the posture of someone used to getting what they wanted, unaccustomed to barriers. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't shift, flinch, or offer even a glance. Her stillness was its own kind of statement. Around them, other passengers feigned disinterest, their gazes flickering just long enough to register the unfolding dynamic before retreating into tablets and books. But the air had changed, tense, expectant, like the quiet before a match was struck. And somewhere inside that quiet, Jasmine already knew this wouldn't be the last interruption. Not tonight, not on this flight. The silence in the aisle stretched thin, brittle like glass. The blonde woman, Camilla Vaughn, remained standing, her gaze fixed on Jasmine's seat with increasing irritation. When subtle signals failed to move the situation forward, she shifted tactics. Her voice didn't rise, but her tone turned performative, drawing the attention of nearby passengers under the veil of polite confusion. Jasmine remained motionless. The pages of her notebook lay open before her, but she wasn't reading them anymore. Her senses had tuned instead to the familiar rhythm of entitlement cloaked in civility, a rhythm she had heard before in boardrooms and behind podiums always laced with plausible deniability. This wasn't about procedure, not really. It was about presence, her presence. A flight attendant returned this time with a composed but hesitant demeanor. His name tag read Ethan. He smiled carefully, then turned toward Jasmine holding a digital tablet. The screen illuminated softly as he scrolled with a practiced hand, searching for the polite way to shift her. Not to accuse, not to confront, but to suggest, to accommodate, to make things easier, to resolve a small mix-up. Ethan's voice remained even, but his suggestion carried a distinct undertone. He gestured toward another seat in the first-class cabin, still premium, still comfortable, but not 1A. The logic was packaged in customer service language. Help us keep the peace, just a small favor. We'll make it up to you later. Beneath it all, the message was clear. Move quietly. Jasmine looked up slowly, her expression unreadable. The hum of the cabin had returned, but it now competed with the sharp static of rising tension. Other passengers kept their heads down, yet the tension rippled like a wave beneath their forced detachment. A second attendant approached this time, not smiling. The energy shifted again as Angela Benton arrived, the flight supervisor for the route. With her sharp blazer and clipped strides, she projected the authority of experience, though even she seemed uneasy as she approached. She leaned in, scanning the digital manifest, while listening to Camilla speak in hushed tones laced with frustration. Angela then turned toward Jasmine. Her words were polished, but her request was no different than Ethan's. Jasmine was asked once more, this time more directly, to change seats, not for any error in booking, not for policy, but for the sake of resolution, for the sake of peace, for the sake of avoiding conflict with a high-status passenger. Jasmine said nothing. Her stillness returned sharper than before. It was no longer just about her seat. It had become a mirror reflecting everything unspoken but deeply embedded about who is expected to yield and why. Camilla crossed her arms, a smirk forming at the corners of her lips as she watched the interaction unfold. She believed the system would bend as it always had. She believed Jasmine would yield as others had. But the cabin was shifting now in subtle ways Camilla hadn't yet noticed, and Jasmine had no intention of moving. Jasmine's fingers hovered for a moment over the cover of her notebook before closing it with deliberate finality. The quiet thud of leather against leather seemed louder than it should have been, cutting through the hum of the cabin like a gavel striking wood. She reached into the inner pocket of her blazer, retrieving a slim phone with practiced ease. No one said a word. They didn't need to. Camilla stood nearby, her expression hardening as she watched. Angela, the flight supervisor, lingered with folded arms, uncertainty flickering in her stance. Ethan loitered a few rows away, posture rigid, caught between protocol and pressure. Jasmine's gaze didn't meet any of theirs. Instead, she tapped the screen and lifted the phone to her ear. Her voice, when it came, was low and even too quiet for the passengers around her to hear, but unmistakable in tone. It wasn't a plea. It was a notification. Not a complaint, a report. Across the aisle, Angela straightened slightly, her breath catching when the weight of the moment finally landed. Something about Jasmine's composure unsettled her. The way she didn't raise her voice didn't escalate emotionally. The silence spoke louder than protest. The message was unmistakable. She wasn't bluffing. Ethan's nervous glances betrayed his thoughts. He had seen passengers attempt to pull rank before empty threats about calling someone. But this was different. Jasmine wasn't threatening. She was activating. Camilla, still confident in her place at the top of the food chain, didn't seem to register the shift. She turned to glance out the window, her body language smug, as if her status would shield her from consequence, as if nothing serious could possibly come of this. Jasmine ended the call with a simple press of her thumb and returned the phone to her pocket. She didn't make eye contact. She didn't offer further explanation. She simply resumed her seat, picked up her notebook, and reopened it, her eyes skimming lines she had already memorized. Angela stepped away without another word. The look in her eyes had changed. The calm mask of control had cracked ever so slightly, and uncertainty had begun to seep through. A ripple of tension passed through the cabin. The overhead lights dimmed. A delay notification appeared on the passenger screens, vague in wording but impossible to ignore. Flight 497 would not be departing on time. Jasmine remained still, her fingers idly flipping a page. Across the cabin, Camilla's brow furrowed slightly as she registered the change. She sat down, but her confidence didn't settle with her. There was something new in the air, now unspoken but undeniable. She had assumed this would be a simple correction, a momentary inconvenience, a minor adjustment to reaffirm her place. But something had shifted, and she no longer held the upper hand. Behind the closed curtain of the galley, whispers turned sharper. Angela's voice, once steady with authority, now trembled at the edges. Ethan stood beside her, arms folded tightly, his eyes darting toward the cabin every few seconds. Their movements were tense, rehearsed professionalism crumbling under the weight of uncertainty. They weren't just responding to a difficult passenger anymore. They were reacting to something they didn't understand, something larger. They had underestimated her. Out in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. No one spoke yet. Everyone was listening. Passengers flipped pages of unread magazines, stared at blank tablet screens, or sipped drinks that had long since gone warm. The delay, unexplained by any formal announcement, hung like a fog over every seat. Jasmine sat unmoved. Her notebook rested on her lap, open to a page filled with structured thoughts and strategy trees, but her focus had shifted. She didn't need to speak to be heard. Her presence now carried its own gravity. The power wasn't in what she had said, but in what had followed after. Across the aisle, Camilla finally began to notice. Her initial confidence had begun to erode, replaced with an unease she couldn't name. She had seen people complain before. She had even seen passengers removed. But never had she seen stillness become strategy. Never had she seen quiet become leverage. She glanced at Jasmine, hoping to find a reaction, an expression, a signal of retreat. There was none. Jasmine didn't look at her. She didn't need to. Angela returned to the cabin, her posture no longer commanding but cautious. The carefully crafted lines of her authority now softened by something she hadn't expected: consequence. She passed Jasmine without stopping, her pace quickening slightly as she moved toward the front of the aircraft. Ethan lingered behind for a few seconds longer, his eyes sweeping the cabin before settling on Jasmine. There was something in his gaze now, curiosity, maybe even regret, but he said nothing. He simply turned and followed. Camilla shifted again, her arms tightening around her torso. For the first time since boarding, she looked small. The whispers from across the aisle had grown into full glances now. Other passengers, once feigning disinterest, had begun to read the silence correctly. They understood. They knew power when they saw it. And Jasmine, she remained still. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She didn't need validation. The moment had already turned. This wasn't about a seat anymore. It wasn't about airline policy or tier status. It was about perception, about who was expected to yield and who was allowed to hold their ground. And now the narrative had shifted. The woman they tried to silence had never raised her voice. And yet, without saying a word, she had changed the entire room. The hush in the first-class cabin deepened as the minutes passed. The glow of overhead lights cast soft halos above each row, and yet there was a subtle heaviness in the air, an invisible weight pressing down with growing intensity. What had started as a private dispute had grown into something undeniable, something that no one could look away from anymore. Then it happened. The forward cabin door opened with a sharp pneumatic hiss. Two figures stepped through. They were not part of the flight crew, nor did they wear the standard corporate uniforms of gate agents or service managers. Instead, they were dressed in dark suits, sharp, clean, and deliberate. One held a tablet against his chest. The other carried a slim black briefcase. Their presence shifted the entire atmosphere of the cabin like a cold wind entering a warm room. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Angela appeared from the galley almost immediately, her expression tense, posture no longer authoritative but restrained. She stepped forward with the composure of someone hoping to retain control of a situation that had already slipped past her fingertips. The taller of the two men spoke quietly, flashing a badge with the airline's executive crest. He requested to speak with the crew. Angela nodded stiffly. Ethan emerged a moment later, shoulders squared but face pale, and followed them toward the galley. The curtain slid closed behind them with a soft shh. The remaining passengers exchanged glances. A few shifted in their seats. Most remained still, eyes darting toward the front of the plane, pretending to be uninterested but clearly alert. Tension and curiosity now gripped every row. Jasmine sat motionless. She didn't look toward the galley. She didn't track the corporate men with her eyes. Her notebook remained open, untouched now, but still resting lightly on her lap. Her body language was unchanged, relaxed, poised, serene. But the shift in power was unmistakable. This was no longer a flight delay. It was an internal reckoning. Inside the galley, the discussion was brief. There were no raised voices, no emotional outbursts, only a cold presentation of facts followed by swift, irreversible consequences. Angela was the first to emerge. Her face was drained of color, her walk no longer sharp but slow, mechanical. Ethan followed closely, his tablet-gone arms stiff by his sides. Both were escorted to the front of the cabin, where the lead representative gestured toward the exit. The door opened again. They were gone. Silence followed. Then came the final wave. One of the corporate representatives walked down the aisle with calm precision. He stopped beside Jasmine's row and inclined his head in quiet recognition. He said something low, respectful. Jasmine gave a small nod in return, barely lifting her gaze. Whatever exchange passed between them, it was brief and definitive. The man continued on, returning to the front where his colleague waited. Across the cabin, Camilla had grown visibly tense. Her arms were locked across her chest, jaw clenched tightly. She had watched it all unfold, first with confidence, then confusion, now with barely concealed panic. For the first time, the structure she had relied on, the hierarchy she had assumed would protect her, had failed to move. And worse, it had moved against her. Security personnel were now visible outside the open cabin door. Not in a threatening way, but in the unmistakable manner of protocol about to be enforced. Camilla shifted in her seat. She realized the game had changed, and she wasn't the one holding the board anymore. The cabin had settled into a false calm. Passengers had returned to their devices and half-finished drinks, pretending to be immersed while their eyes flicked up at every sound from the front of the plane. The scent of citrusy cleaning spray hung faintly in the air, mingling with the quiet churn of recycled oxygen. Everything looked normal, except it wasn't. Camilla sat upright in 2B, stiff and bristling. Her fingers drummed an erratic rhythm on the armrest nails, tapping against leather like distant thunder. The easy confidence that had carried her through the first half of the confrontation had evaporated, replaced by a mixture of confusion and smoldering disbelief. Her world had always answered to her. Doors opened. Requests were granted. Exceptions were made. But not today. She shifted in her seat, shooting quick glances toward the galley where the suited executives remained in quiet conversation. Her lips moved soundlessly, rehearsing words she wasn't yet ready to say aloud. Her companion beside her, silent since the confrontation began, sat frozen eyes locked on the back of the seat ahead, shrinking further with every minute. Then the moment came. One of the corporate men, the taller one with the tablet still in hand, stepped into the aisle. He walked slowly but purposefully toward Camilla's row. Every footstep seemed to echo in the silence. When he stopped beside her, his voice was low, but his posture made the message clear. She wasn't staying. Camilla's reaction was immediate. Her body recoiled slightly, a flush rising up her neck. She looked from the man to the nearby passengers, scanning for signs of support, outrage, or even hesitation. But none came. Their eyes dropped the moment she met them, avoiding, disassociating, distancing. There was no saving grace. Her protest began in silence. A clenched jaw, narrowed eyes tightly, wound indignation. Then the tension burst. Her hands flailed in sharp gestures, her words rising in volume, her posture turning defiant. She pointed. She shook her head. She demanded. She invoked her loyalty, her status, her contributions to the airline. Her voice cracked, not with fear, but with disbelief. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go, but the man didn't flinch. His response was quiet, clinical, final. Her behavior, he explained, had disrupted the cabin environment. Her refusal to follow crew direction, her escalation of a resolved issue, her attempts to undermine another passenger's rights, none of it could be ignored. He gestured toward the front of the plane. Security was waiting. Camilla remained in her seat for one final second of resistance, lips pursed, spine stiff before she stood. Not because she agreed, not because she relented, but because she had run out of ground to stand on. As she gathered her belongings with jerky movements, the cabin watched without watching. Eyes flickered away, then back again. The silence was no longer passive, it was full of consequence. She moved toward the front, flanked by the suited representative and a uniformed officer now visible at the cabin door. Her exit was swift, but her presence lingered like perfume, strong, sharp, and unwanted. Jasmine never looked up. She remained in her seat, unmoved, her notebook still open on her lap, a pen resting lightly between her fingers. The pages remained untouched, but the words already written there felt heavier now. Her silence, once overlooked, had outlasted the noise. As the cabin door shut with a soft but resolute thud, the mood shifted again. Not relief, not celebration, but clarity. The hierarchy had tilted. The expectation had crumbled. And the woman who once claimed the right to command the room had just been escorted out of it. No speeches, no justice speeches, just quiet resolution and accountability at last. The cabin door closed with a muted hiss, sealing the plane and the moment into stillness. The hiss was not just mechanical, it felt symbolic, final. The sound of Camilla's departure still echoed quietly in the minds of those left behind, but no one said a word. There was no applause, no outburst of commentary, only a lingering hush that carried more weight than any speech could have. Flight 497 sat idle on the tarmac, the runway lights glowing faintly against the night sky. Outside the oval windows, the last traces of twilight had faded, replaced by shadows and the distant twinkle of city light. Inside, passengers began to move again slowly and carefully, as if adjusting to a different kind of gravity. A new tone had been set. Flight attendants moved through the aisle once more, this time with softened expressions and clipped deference. Their gestures were smaller, more controlled, no longer routine. Something had shifted in the air, not out of fear, but respect. Every motion now seemed aware, conscious of the boundary that had been crossed and corrected. Jasmine remained seated, the pen in her hand resting lightly against the edge of her notebook. She hadn't written a single word since the moment began, and yet her presence had rewritten the order of the cabin. She looked out the window briefly, her expression unreadable but composed, as if cataloging the exact moment the balance of power had shifted, not just for her, but for what she represented. A few rows back, passengers exchanged quiet glances, some respectful, others contemplative. They knew they had witnessed something. They might not have fully understood it yet, but instinct told them it mattered. It had not been a confrontation. It had been a revelation. The intercom chimed softly, and the captain's voice returned, measured, composed, and direct. No mention was made of the incident, only a brief acknowledgement of the delay and a thank you for everyone's patience. But his tone was different now, grounded, sober. as though he too had seen the silent shift in hierarchy and recognized where the true authority had stood all along. Soon after the aircraft began to taxi, the engines hummed back to life, filling the cabin with a familiar vibration. Heads leaned against windows, seatbelts clicked, devices returned to laps. Routine resumed, but the atmosphere was permanently altered. Across from Jasmine's row, a young flight coordinator approached, his posture formal, but his face faintly apologetic. He handed her a small card, an apology on behalf of the airline, and an offer of extended first-class benefits. She took it without expression, glanced at it briefly, and placed it between the pages of her notebook. It wasn't the offer that mattered. It was the recognition, the acknowledgement. As the aircraft lifted into the night sky, leaving the tarmac behind, the city below shrank into a glittering trail of light. Jasmine leaned back in her seat, her posture finally softening, not in surrender but in clarity. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't stood up. She hadn't delivered a monologue about injustice, and yet the outcome was undeniable. She had stayed seated and the system had moved around her. In the days that followed, headlines would quietly circulate. An internal review, a reassignment of crew, a revision of customer protocol, and eventually, a press release brief understated announcing updated diversity training, revised first-class dispute procedures, and a commitment to reinforcing values of dignity and fairness across all touchpoints. No names were mentioned, but those who had been there understood. They had seen how a single seat protected not with anger but with resolve had become more than a place. It had become a boundary, a mirror, a reckoning. Jasmine never told the story. She didn't need to. Her silence had already spoken louder than any voice ever could. Cruising high above the Atlantic Flight 497 sliced through the night sky like a silent arrow. The cabin lights had been dimmed, casting a soft glow over the interior. Most passengers had settled into the hum of altitude, reading, dozing, or simply staring into the dark void outside their windows. But the stillness carried a new weight now, one shaped not by altitude, but by what had unfolded before they ever left the ground. In seat 1A, Jasmine Reed sat quietly, her eyes no longer on her notebook but on the stars scattered across the deep black sky. Her expression was calm, almost reflective. The chaos, the confrontation, the cascade of consequences, it was all behind her now, but the echo of it lingered, not in noise but in the change it left behind. There had been no shouting, no public spectacle, no emotional breakdown to justify removal, no dramatic accusations to dominate the narrative. Only choice, only presence, only the strength to hold space without shrinking. And because she had chosen not to yield, everything else had been forced to shift around her. Elsewhere in the cabin, the silence had taken on a different tone. Passengers who had once looked away now carried something heavier in their glances, a recognition, perhaps even discomfort. They had seen something that challenged the quiet systems they relied on to keep the world in its comfortable balance. A woman who didn't fit the expected mold had taken up space without apology, and the world around her had attempted and failed to dislodge her. And she had done it without raising her voice. She hadn't demanded anything beyond what she had already paid for. She hadn't threatened until provoked. She hadn't tried to win anyone over. She had simply refused to disappear. That refusal had been more powerful than any declaration. It had exposed the scaffolding that many were too polite to acknowledge, the assumptions about who deserves what, who gets the benefit of the doubt, who must accommodate, and who gets accommodated. And for once, the system had been forced to confront itself. Security hadn't been called on the one who stood her ground. The ones who bent policy to favor the entitled had been removed instead. The woman who expected to win through familiarity, charm, and subtle force had been escorted off the aircraft. Her status revoked her influence, neutralized. And the woman who simply stayed still had remained not because someone allowed her to, but because she had never needed permission. This was not a story about revenge. It wasn't about humiliation or punishment. It wasn't even about the airline. It was about power, real power. The kind that doesn't need volume or validation. The kind that sits quietly, breathes deeply, and doesn't flinch when pressed. The kind that forces others to choose between preserving their comfort or facing their conscience. Jasmine didn't ask to be a symbol. But in that cabin among strangers behind rows of expensive seats and embroidered headrests, she became one. A symbol not of resistance in the loud rebellious sense, but of sovereignty, of dignity, of unshakable clarity in the face of manufactured doubt. The plane would land and the news cycle would pass. There would be other delays, other disputes, other names. But this one would leave a mark. Some passengers would forget her name. Others would forget the flight. But no one would forget how it felt. That moment when silence had the final word, and power was redefined not as dominance or persuasion, but as the quiet, immovable choice to remain.